If your parents only see you as an inconvenience, do you owe them anything when they fall? That's the question I've been asking myself for years. And now, after everything that's happened, I finally know the answer. My name is Connor Bennett. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in what most people would call a normal middle-class family. We weren't struggling. We weren't wealthy, just comfortably in the middle. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. But if you stepped inside our house, you'd think my sister Ashley and I were born into two completely different families. Ashley was the golden child, the daughter my parents had always dreamed of. She got lavish birthday parties, expensive clothes, and a brand new car the second she got into college. Every wish, every whim, they fulfilled without hesitation. And then there was me, Connor, the obligation, the burden they had to put up with for 18 years. My existence was tolerated, not cherished. I never asked for much, just a little acknowledgement, a little encouragement. I had a passion for cooking, something that made me feel alive, like I had a purpose. But to my parents, it was a joke, a cute little hobby that would never amount to anything. And then, the day I turned 18, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. With the coldest expressions I'd ever seen, they gave me 1 month to pack my things and leave. But here's the real question. What would you do if your own parents treated you like a temporary guest in their home? Let us know in the comments, because stories like these happen more often than you'd think. This is a real story, originally shared on Reddit's r/true off my chest. Betrayed, abandoned, and forced to survive on his own. What happens next will shock you. Welcome to Reddit True Vault. If you love hearing real, raw stories straight from Reddit, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Now let's dive in. My dad, Mark Bennett, was a construction worker, big, strong, and always covered in dust and sweat. He believed in real work, the kind that left calluses on your hands and sweat dripping down your back. And my mom, Susan, spent most of her time at home, keeping up appearances, making sure our family looked perfect from the outside. She played the role of the caring mother well enough, at least when other people were watching. For most of my childhood, I thought I had a normal life. I wasn't treated like royalty the way Ashley was, but my parents still took care of me. I had food on the table, a roof over my head, and every now and then, my dad would ruffle my hair after a long day at work and call me champ. My mom would hum while making dinner, and even though she never asked about my day, at least she didn't hate the sound of my voice. But even then, there were cracks in the foundation, small, barely noticeable at first, but they grew. Ashley always got more. More attention, more patience, more love. If she wanted a toy, she got it. If I wanted one, I had to prove I deserved it. If she got in trouble, there was always an excuse. She didn't mean it. She's just tired. Don't be so hard on her. But if I so much as raised my voice, I was being difficult. I was being ungrateful. I remember one time when I was 7, Ashley broke a vase. She cried, ran to Mom, and within seconds, she was being comforted. I was standing there, frozen, because I knew what was coming. Connor, Mom snapped, already angry. Why weren't you watching your sister? I wasn't even in the same room. Little things like that kept happening. And the worst part? I started convincing myself it wasn't a big deal, because at least I was still part of the family. At least, back then, they still acknowledged me. But the moment I found my passion for cooking, I wasn't just the lesser child anymore. I was a disappointment. But everything changed the moment I picked up a knife and started cooking. I still remember the first time I fell in love with it. I was 10 years old, standing on a chair in our tiny kitchen, watching a chef on TV effortlessly chop onions like it was second nature. I wanted to try it myself. So I did. I made the messiest, most unevenly cut vegetables you could imagine, but I was hooked. At first, my mom brushed it off like a joke. She laughed, called it cute. My dad barely acknowledged it, just muttered something under his breath about how kitchen work was meant for women. But I didn't care. I kept going. By the time I was 12, I made my first real dish, homemade pasta. I was so proud of it. I placed it on the dinner table, waiting for some kind of reaction. My mom took one bite and set her fork down like I'd just ruined her appetite. My dad didn't even look away from the TV. But Ashley, she wrinkled her nose in disgust, acting like I had done something embarrassing. The words she said stuck with me for years. That was the moment I realized things were never going to change. For a while, they ignored it, like they were hoping this phase would just go away. But I kept going. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd watch cooking videos, memorizing techniques, testing them out when no one was around to complain about the smell. While other kids were playing video games, I was in the kitchen, perfecting my knife skills and figuring out how to sear a steak just right. By the time I was 15, I knew this wasn't a phase. This was what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a chef. That was the first time my dad truly looked at me with disappointment. He never hid the fact that he believed a man should work with his hands. Real work, the kind that left you sweaty, exhausted, and covered in grime. A man was supposed to build, lift, and break things, not stand over a stove plating food like an artist. He didn't come right out and say it at first, but I could feel it in the way he talked about my future, in the way his face hardened every time I so much as mentioned cooking. Mom wasn't any better. She never argued with him. She never defended me. Just sat there, silent, like she had already made peace with the fact that I wasn't the son she wanted. Ashley, of course, thought it was hilarious. She had always loved attention, and at some point, my passion for cooking became just another thing she could use as entertainment. I'd hear her laughing about it with her friends, making snide comments when I wasn't even in the room. It was all just a joke to her. Connor, the little housewife. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself that as long as I worked hard, as long as I got good enough, they'd have to respect me eventually. I was wrong. When I was 17, I made what I thought was the best decision of my life. I applied to culinary school. I had spent months researching programs, writing my application essays with more effort than I had ever put into anything. When the acceptance letter arrived, I could hardly believe it. For the first time, I felt like I was finally on the right path. For just a second, I let myself believe they would be proud of me. That belief shattered the second I told them. My dad erupted with anger the moment the words left my mouth. It wasn't just frustration, it was rage. The kind that made his face turn red, his jaw clench, his fists tighten like he was holding himself back from saying something worse. He didn't care about culinary school. He didn't care about my dreams. All he saw was a future he didn't approve of, a son he couldn't respect. Mom wasn't much better. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with that expression, the one I had come to know too well. Like she had finally given up on me. Like she had already written me off as a mistake. She sighed, shaking her head. The only words she said before walking away cut deeper than any insult my dad could have thrown at me. Ashley didn't say a word. She didn't even react. Just sat there, scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered, as if nothing happening in that room had anything to do with her. That night, I heard my parents talking in the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words, but I already knew what was coming. The next morning, they sat me down again. No yelling this time. No anger. Just cold, emotionless finality. I had 1 month. 1 month to pack my things and get out. At first, I thought it was a sick joke. I waited for a punchline that never came. They didn't care where I went. They didn't care if I had a plan. They just wanted me gone. I begged them to let me stay, just until I found a job, just until I figured something out. My dad barely even looked at me as he shut that conversation down. I would figure it out, just like every other man who had to survive in the real world. I packed my bags that night. I didn't have much. Just a small duffel bag stuffed with clothes and a dream that had been stomped on before it ever had a chance to grow. I stood at the front door for a long time, looking back one last time, waiting, hoping for something. A change of heart. A last-minute goodbye. Anything. Dad was on the couch, sipping his beer, eyes glued to the TV. Mom was wiping down the counter like nothing had happened. Ashley was on a video call, laughing about something completely unrelated. No one said a word to me. No one looked up. I walked out the door, stepping into a world that didn't give a damn about me. There was only one place I could go, Uncle Scott's. He wasn't rich. He wasn't the kind of guy who had much to spare. But when I showed up on his doorstep, drenched from the rain, carrying my entire life in one bag, he didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He let me in. And for the first time in a long time, someone looked at me like I mattered. Uncle Scott didn't just give me a place to stay. He understood me. He knew what it was like to be the black sheep of the family, to be treated like an afterthought. The house was small, barely enough space for the two of us. But he told me later that with me there, it finally felt like a home. But he was honest with me. He wasn't going to let me wallow in self-pity forever. He told me straight, I couldn't stay there forever. If I wanted to survive, I had to stand on my own. If I wanted to chase this dream, I had to do it with everything I had. I didn't know it then, but those words were the reason I made it. They were the reason I became the man I am today. That was the night my old life ended. But my story, it was just beginning. I thought getting kicked out was the hardest thing I would ever go through. I thought nothing could feel worse than the moment I walked out of my childhood home, carrying everything I owned in a single duffel bag, knowing no one inside cared if I ever came back. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't leaving. The hardest part was surviving. For the first time in my life, I had no safety net. No warm bed waiting for me at the end of the day, no fridge full of food, no parents to fall back on. Not that they ever would have caught me. I was truly alone. Uncle Scott did everything he could for me, but I knew I couldn't stay forever. His house was small, barely enough for one person, let alone two. He let me sleep on his couch, made sure I had a roof over my head, and even bought me groceries when he could. But I could see it in his eyes, worry. Not because he didn't want me there, but because he knew I needed more than a couch and a few meals. I needed a future. So, I took the first job I could find, dishwashing. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fun. It was 14-hour shifts of standing in a hot, sweaty kitchen, scrubbing dried sauce off plates, stacking trays until my back ached, my fingers cracked, and my feet went numb. I barely slept. I barely ate. Most nights, I came home so exhausted I could hardly think straight. But I refused to quit, because if I quit, I had nothing. The paycheck was small, barely enough for rent, let alone anything else. I cut corners wherever I could. Instant noodles, dollar store rice, whatever I could stretch to make it last. I saved every extra dollar, not for anything practical, but for ingredients. Because even after everything, even after being thrown away for choosing this path, I still loved to cook. So every once in a while, when I had a little money to spare, I bought ingredients and practiced in Uncle Scott's tiny kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me why I was doing this in the first place. Still, the loneliness ate away at me. I didn't have time to make friends. I didn't have time for anything. My world had shrunk down to two places, the restaurant kitchen and Uncle Scott's house. And at the end of the night, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was them. Did they ever wonder where I was? If I was okay? Or had they erased me from their lives the second I walked out the door? I tried not to care. I told myself I was better off without them. But the truth is, it's hard to stop loving people who never loved you back. It wasn't until months later that everything changed. One night, after another brutal shift, I was stacking trays when the head chef, a man named Miguel, walked past me. He stopped, watching me for a second. Then, he asked, "You ever thought about doing more than washing dishes?" At first, I thought he was joking. But then he tossed me an onion and told me to dice it. So I did, and that's when he saw it. The way I held the knife. The way I worked quickly, precisely. He gave me a second onion. Then a third. Then, without another word, he told me to stay late after my shift. That night, for the first time, I got to cook in a real kitchen. It was nothing fancy. Just simple prep work. Chopping, stirring, watching as Miguel worked. But it was enough, because for the first time since being thrown out, I felt like I belonged somewhere. That night turned into a routine. Every shift, after scrubbing the last dish, I stayed late to help Miguel. He taught me how to work the line, how to manage the heat, how to move fast but never rush. And I absorbed everything. The exhaustion didn't matter anymore. The hunger, the loneliness, the aching hands, none of it mattered. Because for the first time in my life, I was working towards something real. Years passed in a blur of long shifts, burnt hands, and endless hours in the kitchen. I climbed the ranks, going from dishwasher to prep cook, from prep cook to line cook. I moved to better restaurants, worked under tougher chefs, learned things they didn't teach in culinary school. By the time I was 25, I was a sous chef. By 27, I was head chef. And at 28, I opened my own restaurant. I still remember the first night we opened. I stood in that kitchen, watching as servers carried out plates of my food. People were eating something I created, something I had poured my soul into, and they loved it. The first newspaper review came a week later. Then the second, then the third. Suddenly, my name was everywhere. Connor Bennett, the rising star of Denver's culinary scene. The chef who turned nothing into something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I had made it. But even then, I never once thought about them. At least, not until Uncle Scott sat me down one night. It was after one of my shifts, years after I had left that house behind. We were having dinner together at his place, something we still did every once in a while. He was older now, grayer, but still the same man who had given me a roof when I had nothing. We talked about life, about work, about how far I'd come. Then, out of nowhere, he sighed, swirling his drink in his glass like he was debating whether to say what was on his mind. Your parents still don't know what they lost, he said finally. But they sure as hell should. I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. What do you mean? That's when he told me. About Ashley. About how, while I was barely scraping by, they had paid for her college in full. About the car they had bought her. About how, even after Dad lost money in some bad investment, they still made sure Ashley never had to struggle. And the worst part? She let them. She never stepped in, never asked about me, never once suggested that maybe, just maybe, her older brother deserved even a fraction of the help she was given. I sat there, listening, feeling nothing at first. Then, slowly it sank in. While I was washing dishes for 14 hours a day, she was living in a dorm, fully funded. While I was sleeping on Uncle Scott's couch, she was driving around in a car they bought for her. While I was struggling to eat, she was vacationing in Europe. I stared at my hands, the same hands that had been raw and bleeding from years of work. The same hands that had built everything I had from nothing. Uncle Scott shook his head. You were never the problem, Connor. You just weren't the child they wanted. That should have been the end of the story. I should have been able to move on, to forget about them, to live my life. But life has a funny way of bringing back the things you thought you left behind. Because just when I thought I'd never hear from them again, they came knocking. That night at Uncle Scott's, I barely slept. It wasn't just the talk about Ashley that unsettled me. It was the way Uncle Scott hesitated, like there was something else he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to. I could see it in the way he kept rubbing his hands together, in the way his foot tapped against the floor, as if his body was trying to say what his mouth wouldn't. The next morning, I packed up to leave. My restaurant needed me back, and I had already stayed longer than planned. But just as I reached for my bag, Uncle Scott finally spoke. There was a weight in his voice I hadn't heard before. He told me to sit down, and that's when he told me everything. My parents had lost everything. It didn't happen overnight. It started with my father making bad investments, trusting the wrong people, gambling with money he thought he couldn't lose. Then came the lawsuits, the debt collectors, the foreclosure notice taped to the front door of the house I once called home. My mother, who had always cared so much about appearances, had done everything she could to keep up the illusion of stability. But in the end, there was nothing left to hold on to. They were homeless now. Uncle Scott swallowed hard before admitting that they had come to him weeks ago, asking for my address. He hadn't wanted to tell them, but they had been desperate, pleading, even. And after seeing them so broken, so unlike the people he once knew, he finally gave in. He looked at me then, guilt written all over his face, as if expecting me to be angry. But I wasn't. I just exhaled, slow and steady, before shaking my head. Even if Uncle Scott hadn't told them, they would have found a way. People like my parents always did. It took them less than a week. I was in the kitchen when one of the waiters came to find me. His voice was hesitant, like he didn't want to be the one delivering the message. There were two people outside asking for me, he said. They claimed to be my parents. For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the counter, my mind racing through a decade's worth of memories. Then, without a word, I removed my apron, set down my clipboard, and made my way to the front of the restaurant. And there they were. I almost didn't recognize them at first. My father, once an imposing figure, looked smaller somehow, as if life had quite literally beaten him down. His clothes were wrinkled, his shoulders hunched forward, the confidence he had always carried now completely stripped away. My mother, who had once prided herself on her appearance, looked exhausted. Her hair was unkempt, her usual perfect posture replaced by a stiffness that made her seem fragile. They looked like people who had spent too long fighting a battle they had already lost. I didn't speak right away. I just crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway, waiting. And then my father, voice rough and unfamiliar, said the words I never thought I'd hear from him. They needed my help. For the first time in their lives, they needed something from me. My mother's voice wavered as she explained their situation, as if she couldn't quite believe she was saying it out loud. They had nowhere to go. No savings, no home, no safety net. Nothing. And for the first time, I wasn't the one begging. I let the silence stretch between us, letting their words settle into the space where apologies should have been, but never came. Then, finally, I tilted my head slightly and asked the only question that mattered. I let their words hang in the air, not because I needed time to process, but because I wanted them to sit with the weight of what they were asking. They had given me nothing, and now they wanted everything. But there was something missing from their story, a piece they were deliberately leaving out. I let my gaze drift past them, as if searching for someone. But I wasn't searching. I already knew the answer. Ashley wasn't here. They hadn't brought her. Of course they hadn't. I exhaled slowly, tilting my head, feigning curiosity. Not anger, not resentment, just an idle thought, like I was asking about the weather. Why wasn't Ashley the one standing here instead of them? My mother's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to answer but couldn't find the words. My father shifted his stance, rubbing a hand over his jaw, looking anywhere but at me. They both knew exactly what I was asking, and they had no answer. For the first time in their lives, they were the ones left standing in silence, waiting for someone else to decide if they were worth saving. But it wasn't over. A week after my parents showed up at my restaurant, Uncle Scott came by to visit. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by whenever he was in town, but something about this visit felt different. He brought a small bag of groceries, just a few things he thought I'd like, a habit he had never dropped, even when I could afford more than he ever could. We sat in my kitchen, eating in comfortable silence. He asked about the restaurant, about whether I was finally taking some time for myself instead of working 16-hour shifts. The conversation was easy, familiar, but there was something in the way he spoke, in the way he kept glancing at me between bites, like he was holding something back. And then, just as he was about to leave, he hesitated. He rubbed the back of his neck, exhaled sharply, and finally said the words that changed everything. He told me my parents had gone to him before they came to me. They had begged him to talk to me, pleaded for him to convince me to help them. They told him they had no one else, that they didn't know what to do. He had put them off for as long as he could, knowing I wouldn't care, knowing it wasn't his place to get involved. But the part that really got me, the part that made something bitter settle deep in my chest, was what he said next. Before they came to me, they had gone to Ashley first. Of course they had. She had always been their first choice. Their perfect child. Their investment. And when they asked for help, she had simply told them she didn't have the money. Not because she couldn't afford it. Not because she was struggling. But because she had never once been taught what it meant to be responsible for anyone but herself. She had everything handed to her. Every bill paid. Every obstacle removed before she even had to worry about it. And the second those same people who had sheltered her from hardship needed her to return the favor, she shrugged it off. She told them she loved them, but she just didn't have extra cash lying around. Meanwhile, she was living comfortably in a nice house with her husband, driving a car they had bought her, sitting on a degree they had paid for in full. The worst part, they didn't blame her. They didn't get angry. They didn't resent her for abandoning them. They just accepted it and moved on. Moved on to the one person they had spent years pretending didn't exist. Me. Because no matter how much they had dismissed me, no matter how quickly they had thrown me away, they still knew the kind of person I was. They knew I was the responsible one. The one who had spent his entire life trying. The one who wouldn't let someone drown, even if that someone had once left him to sink. And they were hoping, after everything, that I still cared. For a second, I almost wished I did, but I didn't. It didn't take long for my parents to find out that Uncle Scott had told me the truth. 2 days later, they showed up at my restaurant again. This time, they weren't just desperate. They were pleading. I didn't let them in. I stepped outside, arms crossed, watching as my mother wrung her hands together, as my father shifted on his feet, struggling to find the right words. They told me I was all they had left. I let the words hang in the air, feeling nothing. It was true. They had put everything into Ashley, and in the end, she had turned her back on them without hesitation. But me? I had never been part of the equation. Not when I was 18 and they kicked me out. Not when I was working 14-hour shifts just to survive. But now that they had nothing, suddenly, I was their son again. I waited for the anger, for the resentment, for the satisfaction of seeing them finally understand what it felt like to be discarded. But there was nothing left to feel. I looked them both in the eye, and for the first time, I saw it, the realization. They knew, even before they came here, that they had already lost me. They had lost me the moment they let me walk out that door 10 years ago. I thought back to the night they had sat me down at the kitchen table and told me I had 1 month to leave. The way they had looked at me like I was nothing more than a burden, a loose end that needed to be cut. And then, with a steady voice, I told them the same words they had once told me. They needed to be independent. They needed to figure it out. And then, without another word, I turned my back on them. I walked back inside, and I closed the door, for good. But the story didn't end there. A week after I closed the door on my parents, I received a letter. No return address, but I already knew who it was from. Inside was a single photograph, an old picture of me as a child, standing in front of our family home, grinning like I had the whole world ahead of me. On the back, written in shaky, almost unrecognizable handwriting, were just 5 words. "We're proud of you. We're sorry." I stared at it for a long time, turning the words over in my mind. Maybe they meant it. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was just desperation. I didn't know. And honestly, it didn't matter. I folded the letter, placed it in the back of my drawer, and never looked at it again. Not because I forgave them, but because I simply didn't know what to do with it. Because at the end of the day, I don't owe them anything. I built this life without them, and I'm never looking back. And that's the story of Connor Bennett, the son who was cast aside, only to rise above the ashes. From being abandoned with nothing at 18 to becoming a respected chef with a life built entirely on his own terms, he proved that sometimes walking away is the only way to move forward. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands by you when the world turns its back. And sometimes, the hardest but most necessary choice is to walk away. What would you have done in his place? Would you have given them another chance or closed the door for good? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Reddit True Vault. Because some stories don't just deserve to be told, they deserve to be heard.